the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we begin our discussion today, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider contributing $1 a month there. That'll give you access to our Discord server. Taylor's been running a few reading groups there. I think we're on our second book, and the participation has been pretty great. We've been posting that audio up to the Patreon as well, so that content is
for
available.
all members, including free members.
Oh, I didn't realize. I didn't realize you were doing that. Okay, nice.
Even if you don't have $1 to spare, come support us. Come join the Discord. You can still join as a free member.
Well, I don't know if you have access. I think you have to be to get the Discord access. You have to be a member. But I think if you come to our Patreon, I think you can then access the audio. Yes. So is that a logical opposition or a real opposition? Oh
shit.
But I'd make that joke just to sort of, set us up, because we're going to be taking a look at an essay from Immanuel Kant today, Attempt to Introduce the Concept of Negative Magnitudes in Philosophy, which I think has far-reaching effects into, there's so much sort of, I don't know if you'd call it necessarily tertiary, maybe secondary relationship to like Freud. Mm-hmm. Obviously Deleuze, certainly Deleuze is...
Yep.
Highly relevant to this discussion. I think Simondon as well. So
I can see some at the end when he starts talking about God. I could see some connections with Spinoza.
Nice. Okay.
He directly references Leibniz, right? And
yes.
agreeing with his contention that we sense the whole cosmos, we apperceive it, but only a tiny fraction, a tiny infinitesimal fraction do we actually clearly perceive. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, I was just introducing the text. I don't know if we want to jump in with maybe start. I don't know if this logical and real opposition distinction would be fertile ground to start at.
Yeah, I'll have some general comments, and then we can because that's obviously one of the important distinctions he makes, right? I would say this is an interesting essay. One reason for it, one thing that's interesting is this is, we could say, so to speak, the young Kant, right? He's a younger boy,
young Kantian.
Young Kantian, right? He's so this would be, I think this essay is, I'm looking for the date. I'm sorry. So this is 1763. And Kant lived in maybe in his late 70s, early 80s. So he was finishing the third critique when he was fairly old. Okay, so he lived to be...
There's still time for us in the fourth critique.
Mm-hmm. So he would have been, what did I say? 1763? So he would have not yet been 40. So compared to the critiques, he's a young boy, he's a young lad writing this essay. And I will say one thing that's interesting is that in the West, negative numbers weren't introduced until the 15th century in mathematics. And even outside the West, they were something, I think the 8th, 9th century in India were first introduced in mathematics. So that's a kind of interesting thing that they don't date back many thousands of years. Relative to a lot of understandings of mathematics, they're a little bit more recent, specifically in the West. And
even
of course,
zero, right? Sumerians invented zero, allegedly.
There you go. So zero has a much longer history than negative numbers, which is surprising. It seems like they would go together.
Yeah,
right?
that seems like that would be the fulcrum.
Mhm. I mean, obviously, subtraction was something that's old, but I suppose the formal, maybe axiomatic exposition, if you want to call it that, or just a formal understanding of negative numbers outside of subtracting in a very basic way, because it wouldn't make sense to think that subtraction is that young, right? But negative numbers, and if I don't know if you saw some of the footnotes, which were interesting. Let me just take a look at before this again. General remarks opening up to the text, and we can get started on some of the concepts he brings up. Let me find. I think there was something interesting in the translator's footnotes. See. Wait, is this it? No, that's wrong. Okay. So so footnote 10 says negative numbers were first employed by Hindus to represent debts. So that's kind of interesting, right? It says Brahmagupta around 628 AD was the first mathematician to employ negative numbers. So 628 AD, obviously debts existed a lot longer than that, but it is interesting that the use of them in mathematics became, it does make sense that it would have its origin in debts. And then the other thing that's interesting, in the 16th century, Michael Stiefel was responsible for popularizing the German symbols plus and minus at the expense of the Italian P and M. So we get the plus and minus symbol around, the 16th century. And here's what I found fascinating in this footnote. Stiefel did not regard negative numbers as numbers in the full sense, calling them absurd numbers. This was also the view of Pascal, Cardano, Newton, Arnaud, and to a certain extent Leibniz too. The problem of the sense in which negative numbers were numbers at all preoccupied mathematicians throughout the 16th and 17th century. So I think that's kind of interesting, right? I mean, and I like that negative numbers were called absurd numbers because, we have, like
irrational numbers, right?
We have irrational numbers. We have imaginary numbers, right? Which are by no means imaginary in a Lacanian or even an everyday sense, but in the sense in which the square root of -1 while having a function is to a certain extent impossible to calculate, and in terms of which it's whatever it would equal can't be represented numerically. If that makes sense, right? In any case, yeah. So absurd numbers, and so I think that Kant, in the 1760s, writing this essay, it's not necessarily that he's obviously he's not intervening in mathematical debates directly, but some of that context in which the absurdity of negative numbers was considered in mathematics in the previous century, I think it still made it a relevant topic for specifically considerations of philosophy. So that's kind of the general background for this essay. And as you brought up, Coop, we will see that Kant does not think of negative magnitudes as absurd by any means, right? He's going to try to give them a sort of real basis and a real ground. And you brought up one of the distinctions he's at pains to make between real opposition and logical opposition. And so we could start there if you like.
Yeah. So logical opposition would be something tied to thought, the law of contradiction, contributing to, a central pillar, let's say, of logic and so forth. Real opposition, more of a physical or metaphysical phenomenon where things can interact and cancel each other out without being in without violating the principle of contradiction or whatever.
Yeah, I like how he says a body which is in motion is something, a body which is not in motion is also something, but a body which is both in motion and also in the very same sense not in motion is nothing at all. So that's logical opposition. That would sort of be a contradiction in that sense. But like we can imagine a body, as the example he uses, again, very simple, having a force moving it in one direction and an equal and opposite force in the opposite direction, and the body remaining at rest, right? That's a real opposition and by no means a contradiction in the logical sense.
My mind immediately goes to Freud and like the fore and aft pressure.
Yeah. We've talked about this. It's kind of fascinating that the primal repressed for Freud, right, the bedrock of the unconscious, has this attractive gravity sort of suctioning as though like a black hole, right, with a force attracting it downward. And there's also a force and after pressure coming from the pre-conscious conscious system that's pushing it. I guess that's the thing, right? It kind of keeps it down, if you will,
into the equilibrium.
Yeah, I do think so. I think there's a to a certain extent, it's an interesting way that Freud talks about it. If you remember, he has an economic metaphor. I'll call it a metaphor, right? But he has the three different models of the unconscious: an economic, a dynamic, and a metapsych, a topographical sort of model for the unconscious. So he's got these three models. That's typically the bulk of what he calls metapsychology. But in any case, in the economic model, if you remember, Freud conceives of working through repression, right? The whole goal is to get patients to recall and remember instead of repeating, right, their symptoms, their repressions. Freud thinks of this as a saving of energy, that it takes more psychical energy to repress than it does to unleash the repression from that deadlock that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I guess sort of the kind of positive vitalistic force of desire or something like that.
Freeing up of libido, what have you, right? I mean, we could talk about it in various ways, but I think that, obviously Freud is thinking about how repeating these repressions get people into, unhealthy, not just habits, but mental anguish, anxiety, blah, 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 right? All the different, but it is interesting that it's like you're freeing up a whole stock of energy that can be employed elsewhere libidinally, right? You can invest in new people, new activities, new what Guattari might call universes of value, right? That those repetitive symptoms like keep us away from. So
I mean, I think that.
Yeah.
Again, it's like an interesting fulcrum for so many of the discussions and thinkers we're discussing always, Deleuze, Freud, etc., in the sense of the concept of the body without organs, zero, where there's that's where things creative potential can exist, right? You know what I'm saying? There's a sort of nexus of potential there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and zero is interesting here because you brought it up earlier. We've talked about it in Lyotard's libidinal economy, right, where he talks about the great zero and all of that, which we don't have time to get into today. But I do think it's interesting. Kant wants to make a distinction between, which I think Deleuze would agree with at least, where the distinction between a negation as a lack or an absence, right? So a true zero equals zero, right? As Kant likes to write, he spells out zero equals, and then the symbol for zero, and what he calls deprivation, right? So one of the examples I like that he gave is look, someone in need, if we ignore them and commit what he calls a sin of omission, right? We don't give to someone in need. That's you can call that a lack or an absence, right? An absence of giving. But if we exploit and take away and deprive someone in need of whatever else they may have to be exploited, that's a different kind of sin. Right. I mean, even if they both are morally wrong, there's something more aggravated. There's a more intense magnitude in the negativity of deprivation. There's a tiny little bit of political implications there, obviously, but Kant takes it to be a moral thing, right? As though it's one individual and another, right? Like a beggar on the street. Whereas it's obvious that the way that he writes it, specifically with the use of the word exploitation, it would immediately be conceivable or applicable to collectivities at large, right? States, for example.
I like the way this thinking of zero as more of a relative than an absolute absence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you can think, right, if we're going to Freud, mental states, right? There's never really a total lack of anything going on, right? It's more like there's a relative equilibrium point that would be the sort of represented by, you could say that would be a zero state or something like that, but it's not a total void. And at that point, I like this calling it a threshold of transformation. And I think that's where maybe the body without organs has some resonance, right? Because that threshold of transformation can be positive or negative, not to even get into the positive or negative magnitude aspect of it, but like, let's say destructive versus creative, or like, those are sort of forces, which are both in the context of this essay would be both, I don't know, what would they be both? There's no, destruction isn't necessarily conceived of as a negative magnitude, right?
It's only relatively negative to whatever's being destroyed, right? So,
but it's like there's takes, destruction requires it requires energy. So it's not stripping away of energy per se, if we want to conceive of it that way, right? Like whether you're creating something or destroying it, obviously, like it's easier to destroy something in a lot of ways than it is to create something, but it still requires a quanta or something. It requires effort. Yeah. It requires work. It requires energy expenditure, maybe the way to really phrase it.
That's right. And this is where I think the opening chapter of Anti-Oedipus, which I believe you're calling to mind with the body without organs, Deleuze and Guattari are kind of very clear about this too, where these negative magnitudes are negative relative to something positive, and that something positive is relative. But the real opposition at play is always something positive in that sense, right? So yes, like you said, no absolute destruction, no absolute zero, and the quote I pulled up the first time they speak about it in Anti-Oedipus, they say the forces of attraction and repulsion, of soaring ascents and plunging falls, produce a series of intensive states based on the intensity equals zero that designates the body without organs. Right. So starting from zero. The calculation of intensity, everything positive on the body without organs, starting from zero, right?
Yeah. I'm also thinking, you mentioned Spinoza. I'm thinking Spinoza as far as, the phrase, what we don't know what a body can do. Mm-hmm. If you extend what a body can do to the body of the earth or a celestial body or something like that, let's say something like a black hole, right? Like you may probably, like in a popular imagination, absolute negation, right? But still a black hole is emitting X-rays. There's always like this remainder that escapes. So there's never this absolute absence of anything, right? Even in a black hole, again, just in the popular imagination, right? You think of absolute zero, going an infinitesimal singularity of negation. But even that is emitting things, and there's still something going on. There's never even a complete lack in something as monstrous as that conceptually, or that concept.
Right. And the attraction, it's a massive force as well, right? So, I mean, like it is a positive, real opposition of against repulsion, like white holes that might have the inverse repulsion. You can imagine that. Yes, it's starting from zero. It's positive, but relative to another force, an equal and opposite force, it would be a negative magnitude. So there's something interesting about this way of conceiving negative magnitudes. It's not some kind of that I guess what I would say is like, lack may come to this zero as a relative lack, right? Lack of movement could be the canceling out of two forces in real opposition equals zero, right? Like we said. But deprivation is still a positing and a positive. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? This use of negative and positive that Kant's trying to get us to see.
I like this phrase here to describe it: dynamic interplay of positive grounds. I think that really highlights what's going on, right?
Yeah, that's
because there's always some expenditure going on. You know what I mean? You could take that back to Freud, repression, right? Unrelieving repression, enforcing repression. You can think about it in terms of an object in orbit, right? You have to travel at a certain speed to escape the pressure or the pull, the gravitational pull of the Earth, or something like that. And also, so you can't travel too fast, so that you don't fly off and out into outer space, etc.
And this is.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, since we're on the topic of black holes, I mean, this is why Guattari specifically, but Deleuze and Guattari together, they themselves talk about black holes. I mean, one thing Guattari is interested in is like when he's doing his reading of Proust and the Machinic Unconscious, he's interested in what he's calling semiotic black holes that they threaten the narrator and they definitely overwhelm and ruin Swann's life by getting him to kind of circulate in this abyss, this spiraling, this downward spiral of repetition based on certain harmful refrains, one could say, right? I mean, there's this attractive force of these semiotic refrains that the narrator almost falls into, but manages to escape away from. Kind of like you were talking about breaking the Earth's gravity. There's a sense in which we have to also break the gravity of the sort of everyday commonsensical ways of thinking. The image of thought that Deleuze talks about, the dogmatic, moral, and orthodox image of thought, has its own kind of gravitation to it, that or opinion itself has its own gravitational force that has to be combated. But again, what was that phrase again? Say it again, Coop. That was the beautiful phrase. Let me see. The dynamic interplay of positive grounds. Yeah. So,
which I think too, like this is where I think Simondon is relevant too, as far as maybe metastability or metastability or what have you, right? Because even I was thinking about, like, I don't know, the relationship between the like technical objects and so forth, and where that kind of, I don't know, there's something where like the technical object bridges this, I don't know, two different dynamic systems as far as, I don't know if I can really bring this to drive this all the way home, but like it bridges that sort of divide. I don't know if you can help, if you see where I'm trying to go with this. I can't think of the specific example.
Well, the example you seem to be bringing up is the one he brings up early in the book, where there's a kind of interplay of heating and cooling provided by the air and the oil being able to like stimulate and run the engine, but it heats up. So it has to be encased in this kind of barrier of water that naturally cools it. And so it allows for a stable dynamism to take place where the machine can run without either overheating or being too cool, right? So there's a kind of milieu that becomes associated with this functionality that's established in the interworkings of the parts, in the interplay of the positive grounds. Maybe that's exactly what you're thinking of.
I mean, pretty much. I think maybe even the example of like the orchid and the wasp, I think might be clearer in that sense because it's more of a like visual reference point, right? Because it's we have these two sort of individuated systems of the orchid and the wasp, but there's a point where they come to interact, right? You know what I mean? It's like the two milieux sort of connect in a way that's, I don't know, maybe that goes to zero or something. You know, I don't know. That in metastability, I'm kind of,
well, the mirror,
I'm butchering it, but
no, it's interesting that the orchid is able to provide a wasp image of a mate, and so it forms a mirroring dynamic interplay with the wasp's sexuality, and the wasp again is able to interplay with the orchid and pollinate the other orchids. So there's a way in which there's a interplay of this aparallel, if you will, animal and plant sexuality going on. And I do think that the other interesting example is just the brick and the mold, right? In the hylomorphic schema, it's assumed that matter, the mass of clay, is just this passive lump, and form is this almost spiritual, godly, active principle that comes to shape the brick. Simondon shows that that's obviously ridiculous, right? It's precisely the fact that the clay and the mold come into interaction. Again, this interplay, this dynamic interplay, positive grounds. The clay's colloidal properties allow it to be shaped, but it provides resistance back against the form, and it's the interaction of the potentials inherent in the clay and the colloidal properties of the clay that have already been prepared, and the pressure from the walls that meet at a certain point and reach a certain threshold of equilibrium. And that's why it's silly to call matter passive and form active, when the true active dimension is in the potentials, right? It's what you were calling metastability. It's precisely metastability that is dynamic, and neither form nor matter captures that alone. And I think I told you this, but Simondon says a hylomorphic model coming from this technical aspect of the brick, conceiving matter as passive and form as active, is really related to a type of social organization where there are masters and slaves, right? Master giving orders like form, and the slaves, even though they're the ones working in the field of knowledge, as Lacan might say, they're the ones, quote unquote, passively receiving the orders. But this schema falls apart very quickly when you introduce metastability. And so Simondon theorizes precisely because science wasn't advanced enough and there wasn't a clear enough model for, there wasn't a clear enough physical model to exemplify metastability, that the ancients were sort of maybe not forced to take the route of a hylomorphic consideration, but never were able to move past that. And it's also a social prejudice, too. It confirmed a social bias of those with power and those without.
Brilliant. You got it. You really you took the ball and ran with that perfectly. I think that was really what I was trying to move towards. You really did that greatly.
But it does exemplify that what's interesting, right, is that the positive grounds that Kant is talking about is not just between the clay as a mass and the walls as a mass. The colloidal properties of clay is molecule by molecule. These molecular chains too are in a kind of resonance with the walls of the mold. And so even on a microscopic level, each molecule is redounding and impacting upon one another until that moment of equilibrium. And Simondon shows that depending on what the mold is made from, the walls of the mold also distend and displace, right? So a thin wooden mold is going to, compared to like an iron cast mold, is going to displace radically. But in whether on the macro or micro level, we can consider that that real opposition of the clay and the mold enter into this resonance. I think that's the word that Simondon would use here. Kant doesn't use it, but this resonance, there's a resonance established between these two orders of magnitude, and they're only negative or oppositional in this relative way. Right. In a relation.
Yeah, because I guess what would you say? Okay, so let's maybe dig into that as far as the negative or negation.
Mm-hmm.
So like you're saying with the resistance of the mold itself is that, I don't know, let's dive into maybe the negative, thinking
Mm-hmm.
about that. I think you, right, popularly or commonsensically, you would think that the mold is exerting. Right, the mold is exerting a force, a negative force on the clay itself, and the clay is also, to some extent,
it's pushing back.
It's pushing out,
mm-hmm.
And so that maybe that's the real opposition.
Yeah, that's the real opposition. The real opposition is established when those forces enter into that equilibrium. When the clay is pushed inward, so the molecules are physically
compacted,
shifted,
right?
Compacted, yeah, and they enter into resonance among each other. And then, as I said, the walls of the material walls of the mold too are pushed back against. But then, even with the thin wooden mold, it'll settle back into place. It'll reach its own equilibrium. So there's a whole number of forces exerted, which Simondon would call communication, right? There's a communication that's established in the resonance.
Yeah.
There's communication and resonance are more or less ways of saying the same thing, but there's a communication of forces between the mold and the clay.
Yeah, or like the Fremen with their thumpers, right? They're creating the vibrations in the sand, and that attracts the worm. There's a type of communication going on there. There's that resonance. Just to give a kind of pop culture example or something. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't fit. You don't think?
I'm trying to think. That's an interesting way of.
I mean, that's maybe more relevant to Simondon than this piece. But I was just thinking of, because that's one thing when we discussed one of these Simondon pieces that I thought was really interesting about the way that we kind of, there's even the hammer and the anvil example, right? Like there's that, the resistance and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Mm-hmm.
a type of information
Yeah,
feedback.
I would
generated.
I would read the thumpers as Deleuze talks about this, the sign and signals flash when these orders of magnitude are brought into initially they're without communication, but they're brought into resonance, and it's the disparity of the forces that are brought into a kind of equilibrium. He talks about this and Simondon does too, in terms of not just in terms of information, but in terms of signals and signs. So yeah, obviously there's information being communicated to the sandworm, and signals are flashing across these dune boundaries.
I mean, it goes back to the example, the way that you articulated the wasp and the orchid, right? The shape of the orchid is communicating something.
Mm-hmm.
It's emitting signs that are being picked up by the wasp and vice versa.
Yeah, and the whole goal, I think, for Deleuze in this example is to avoid any kind of use of resemblance, right? This is why he talks about it in terms of becoming, that there's a becoming wasp of the orchid and a becoming orchid of the wasp. It's also what he picks up from, it's what the guy Remy Chauvin, who popularized this example, and Deleuze cites him, Deleuze Guattari cite him in A Thousand Plateaus in the rhizome introduction. He calls it aparallel evolution. And I think that's what's important, is the aparallel, right? That it's differences communicating, not resemblances. It's not that the orchid in some sort of intuitive knowledge mimics the wasp, and it's something much more complicated than that. We make it way too easy for ourselves if we sort of imagine some sort of consciousness or latent intelligence or blatant intelligence in the orchid, like tricking the wasp. This is also the difficulty, obviously, in theorizing camouflage, which Simondon takes up pretty deeply in the course on perception. I'll have to share that with you later.
Oh yeah, that sounds fucking fire.
So again, like if we try to like postulate that there's something going on the level of resemblances in camouflage, I think that we are begging the question, right? I think that that's for Deleuze, to understand the ontogenesis or becoming, that would be his term, of camouflage is not the same and is more complex than to postulate a kind of mimicry. Even if mimicry does exist in nature on certain levels, the genesis of mimicry and camouflage and these other things seems to require a much more nuanced view. But again, it just goes to the heart of Deleuze's philosophy, not to privilege identity, which the whole history of philosophy has tended to do, not to subordinate difference or have difference be the epiphenomenal outcome when it's in fact the sort of the ungrounding, that's Deleuze's term, of difference is not it's not this subordination to resemblance, similarity, all these other things. That's what he's trying to break out of. So you can see this here too in the wasp and the orchid. And I guess to bring this back to Kant and negative magnitudes, I do think that if we take Kant seriously here in his emphasis on real opposition versus logical opposition, I think we could make the Deleuzian claim that if real opposition, the canceling out of opposite forces, results in zero, for Kant, that identity is a product and not the producer, right? So it's the differences that are productive. And I think Kant tries to go, this is where Kant becomes interesting towards the end of the essay, where Kant will point to the fact that as a sum totality, the world's forces can be totaled up in addition and subtraction in terms of real opposition, and in and for themselves, if you will, within their own internal system, they cancel out, right? They equal zero. It's only in relation to some other will, which he will ascribe to God, right? The divine, or however he phrases it, that not everything cancels out, that there are, if you will, leftovers. And I think that that's why, when Zizek says something about how the reason why there's something rather than nothing is because there's this miscalculation, if you will. And this isn't even Zizek's idea. This may even go back to beyond Leibniz, but there's something similar, right? That there's an error in the calculation of the perfect world, and something falls out as a result, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea that I was getting towards with Spinoza, and like what a body can do, right? Like there's always that something escape, some particle is always escaping. Right, there's always some bit of energy or matter or whatever. If you want to get into Einsteinian physics or whatever, as far as that goes, that's kind of irrelevant. But like, there's always something that is left over. We're never reaching that absolute negation where there's absolutely nothing. There's always something remainder that gets utilized or transformed into a different. Like what is it? The conservation of energy. The principle of the energy is neither created nor destroyed. It just takes different forms or what have you.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think that the Kant's trying to say something similar, and the guarantor of this continual transformation is God, or God's will, or
right. Or if you want to go to like the demiurge or something, and like giving the prime mover, let's say, maybe that would fit better. The prime mover gives the universe a push or something like that, an initial force, and then it just keeps rolling.
I will say though that in that end, if we wanted to stick with your bringing up Spinoza and shift from the body comment to what Deleuze finds interesting. He does find that interesting as well, and he that's a refrain for him. But he also finds interesting Spinoza's univocity, right? So I don't want to go too much into this because it might detract us. But Kant still makes a kind of distinction between the creator and the created, which is a very classical distinction, right? You brought it up with the demiurge, that fits that same model, right?
I mean, even goes back to the idea, the kind of Greek slave master thing too, right?
Yes, master slave, exactly. And for Spinoza, God, Deus sive natura, right? God or nature, substance. Spinoza is at pains to think of God as not separate from creation, right? From what is created. That's partly why he's sometimes thought of as a pantheist or a panentheist, right? Which may or may not, apply. It all depends on if you're interested in those things. So Spinoza's God would be pretty radically different from Kant's God. Let me just read a tiny bit to make this point, and then we can move on, because I know that may not be. It is important, I think, but let's.
No, I'm interested to hear what you're on as far as univocity goes.
So I'm looking for. I'm trying. Give me just a second. This is in the general remarks section at the very end of the essay. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit of this, and then we can discuss it, right? So this starts on page 239. He says, as for this real ground and its relation to its consequence, my question presents itself in the following simple form. How am I to understand the fact that because something is, something else is? A logical consequence is only really positive because it is identical with the ground. Human beings are capable of error. The ground of this fallibility is to be found in the finitude of man's nature. For if I analyze the concept of a finite mind, I see that fallibility is found in it. In other words, I recognize that fallibility is identical with what is contained in the concept of a mind. But the will of God contains the real ground of the existence of the world. The will of God is something. The world which exists is something completely different. And he put that in italics. Something completely different. Nonetheless, the one is posited by the other. The state of mind in which I hear the name Staggerite is something, and it is in virtue of that something that something else, namely my thought of a philosopher, is posited. A body A is in motion, another body B lying in the direct path of A is at rest. The motion of A is something, the motion of B is something else, and yet the one is posited by the other. And then he goes on. Now you may subject the concept of divine willing to as much analysis as you please. You will never encounter in that concept an existent world as something which is contained within the concept of God's willing, or as something posited by that concept through identity. Likewise, in the other case, and he continues, I'm going to skip a little bit of this, but I think this is the very last paragraph. The distinction between logical and real opposition is clearly understood by means of the law of contradiction. And I understand how, if I posit the infinity of God, the predicate of mortality is canceled by it, and is canceled because mortality contradicts infinity. But how the motion of one body is canceled by the motion of another body, that is another question. For the motion of the second body does not stand in contradiction to the motion of the first body. If I presuppose and so again, it seems to be, a few pages before this though, he talks about, basically, he's talking about, interestingly enough, he's talking about the good and desire. And the good is not external to God. The good exists because the eternal representation of its possibility and the pleasure connected with it is the ground of the desire being satisfied. If this is compared with the concrete representation of the nature of the desire of all creatures, it will be noticed that the will of the uncreated being, capital U and capital B, can have very little in common with that of created beings. And even when one considers the other determinations well, what we've just said will come as no surprise if the following fact is properly understood. The difference in quality must be immeasurably great when a comparison is made between things on the one hand, which are nothing in themselves, which, as I said earlier, is the totality of the world considered as positive and negative forces, and that capital B being God on the other, in virtue of which alone everything is. So again, classical opposition between demiurge or even just God, and then and the world, the created world, or between sort of human animal desires and sort of the beatitude, blessedness of God. And I think that and just to reiterate, for Spinoza, right, that is conceived of God as this transcendent being. And I think this is why Deleuze says Spinoza is the prince of philosophers, right? He's the one who hunted down transcendence in all aspects, who hunted down the type of God that would be immanent or immanent, and with an E, right, would stand above creation, rather than be immanent to and with creation, part and parcel of it.
The thought that came to mind was the plane of immanence and actualization and all of that kind of Deleuzian stuff, which you could articulate better than I could. But that's where my mind went, as far as, I don't know, that, because what is it? It's like real, actual, I forget how the phrase goes, right? But it's like the, you know what I mean? The actual and yada.
Real without being actual, ideal without being abstract.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So that's Proust. That's actually from the novel. I believe it's from Time Regained. I think it's from the last volume of his famous novel, In Search of Lost Time. But Deleuze takes that and runs with it and makes it about the virtual. Of course, in Proust's novel, you might apply this to the world of art or the world of involuntary memory quite easily. But Deleuze will, all throughout his work, he's gonna repeat that. And now the interesting thing too is that you could translate that phrase in Proust as real without being present, ideal without being abstract. So again, if you translated it that way, in the Proustian sense, that obviously recalls the involuntary memories, whether it be of the Madeleine, right? That begins the whole. Well, it doesn't. It's at the very beginning of the novel and sets off this search.
Would you say that? I mean, God, maybe this is too obvious after I think about this, but maybe I just missed the whole notion of like almost like the example that Kant does give here as far as mental stimuli goes and the mind being at a state of equilibrium. So is it Swann eats the Madeleine, right? And that,
I think the narrator eats Madeleine.
The narrator.
Right?
Okay, so the narrator eats the Madeleine, and that is the external stimuli that triggers the remembrance, right? So there's a type of, I don't know, there's sort of I don't know if that would be like forced to thought or something necessarily, but like in a sense, right? It's a stimuli. But it's also like in the kind of Simondonian way, it's this almost like there's a sign being emitted by the, I don't know, would it be the flavors or the taste or the like process of digestion generates some type of
test. I assume it'd be the taste and the smell, right? The senses, because in Deleuze at least, it goes from sensibility being taken to its transcendent exercise, which forces memory which forces thought, and then back again. So everything starts with sensibility, and I do think that at least with Simondon, this is what he talks about in terms of not just the establishment of internal resonance, but also in terms of forced movement. There's a forced movement, and in difference repetition with Deleuze, at least, we can see the forced movement is the forcing of sensibility, which forces memory, which forces thought, poses a problem, right? And I think that the problem for Proust's narrator is what do we do with this lost time, this time wasted? And it's about a lesson, right? It's about apprenticeship. It's about learning that inevitably the lost and wasted time and the worldly signs and the signs of love and in the signs of sensibility and involuntary memory lead us to art, to this what Deleuze initially calls essence in 64, right? But that language will become less important, specifically with when he meets Guattari, this language of essence. Not that he like retracts what he said. It's just that that's no longer the problem for Deleuze when he begins adding to his book on Proust. He's going to be more interested in transversality. He's going to be interested in, the end sexualities in Proust, including the wasp and the orchid, but also on the human level as well. He's going to be interested in what you remember, the writer as the spider, right? The body without organs of the spider. So I guess with Kant, yeah, I mean, he does try to apply this notion of negative magnitudes not just to physical bodies, but I think you were alluding to, he's also thinking about the work of the mind, or what he also calls the soul, right, in terms of thoughts, and Kant does try to apply this to the moral domain, as I mentioned earlier, right? It's you can have a sin of omission that's bad enough, that's a lack by not giving to someone in need, but you can have a sin of commission, a deprivation, when you extort and exploit and rob them. And one is a more aggravated version of the other, right? Specifically when it contravenes like civic duty and virtue, right? Again, it has to be relative to some, in opposition to some other thing. Obviously in a lawless world, that may no longer hold, right? I mean, it's very clear in various dystopian imaginings in science fiction. Robbing someone in need may be the means for promoting survival, which is why Kant's he gives the example of animals. Animals they're not contravening any sort of moral law when a predator isn't contravening some moral law, right? And so, anyway, that may seem obvious, but it was good for Kant to at least point that out, right? I think it just reminds me of when Deleuze talks about, in French, the word is bêtise. It's translated in different repetition as stupidity. I prefer to think of it as like foolishness, because the French do have the word stupidity. But, the animal or the beast, because that's where the word comes from, the beast is protected from bêtise, from foolishness, right? It's specifically thinking beings, the image of thought, that actually is merely, at that level at least, is merely an image and actually prevents and hinders thought from occurring, thinking from occurring.
I mean, honestly, I don't know if I feel like we kind of hit a lot of the stuff that I wanted to discuss. Good. Other than maybe to just put a pin in the fact that you can clearly see kind of where this would be copacetic with Deleuze as far as this critique of the lack itself, right?
Yeah.
And the history of philosophy and so forth, and its preeminence.
Yeah.
About productive desire, right? There's a production, there's a motion, there's a dynamism, and not this kind of static transcendence.
I guess that could be a great way to for us to wrap up, because coming back to Anti-Oedipus, that first, maybe second chapter, I have to remember. I think it's the first. I'll double check later. They credit Kant with sort of the first theory of desire as positive, as productive. They just say that he keeps it internal to the will, to wishfulness, caprice, whimsy. But in any case, it's productive of its own object, and I think that Deleuze and Guattari run with that and then want to de-psychologize it. They want to keep it from being locked into the interiority of a psyche. So yeah, that's good to have brought that up as well.
Yeah, this was a good, productive conversation, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And we'll be signing off for this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.